Hey guys, tonight we take a detour from pharaohs and golden tombs.
You won't find yourself draped in lapis lazuli or surrounded by chanting priests.
Instead, you're lying flat on a stone slab in a dark, hot room that smells like tar, onions, and old dreams. A linen cloth sticks to your thigh.
Your nose is full of salt, and someone's reaching in with what looks like a bent iron skewer.
Spoiler alert. You're the guest of honor and the body.
You probably won't survive this. .so.
Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here.
Drop your location and what time it is where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this sleepy caravan travels.
Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not royalty. You never were. But here you are, dead, and still hoping for a decent shot at immortality. The good news? They didn't dump you in the Nile.
The bad news?
You're not exactly on the VIP mummification list. There's no temple procession. No.
Gold inlaid canopic jars. And no alabaster sarcophagus shaped like Osiris.
What you do get is the low-tier embalmer's shed, basically the garage of the underworld. Your embalmer is already sweating, not from grief.
He's just standing over you with a leather pouch of natron swords and an expression that says, "Let's wrap this up literally. Natron, that magical Egyptian drying agent, is actually a mix of baking soda and salt pulled from desert lakebeds."
To you, though, it just feels like someone dumped a sandbox into every crevice of your body. And here's the kicker. You're going to marinate in this stuff for about 40 days.
No sarcophagus yet, just a table, the desert heat, and a constant whiff of whatever died before you.
The smell?
Oh, it's somewhere between beef jerky and melting plastic.
And it sticks.
Historians say the scent of mummification was potent enough to hang around for days.
A few tourists from the 1800s actually fainted during unwrapping ceremonies.
Can't blame them. You smell like immortality gone wrong. Now, while you're drying out like ancient tofu, your family's outside bargaining with the embalmers.
How many
jars can they afford?
Will you get a painted death mask or just a linen swaddle with charcoal doodles? Everything's negotiable.
Even your afterlife. You see, this wasn't just religion, it was business. In Saqqara and Thebes, archaeologists found detailed records of embalming transactions. Some poor souls got deluxe treatment, but others, especially
commoners, were given express versions.
Shorter drying time, cheaper oils, reused tools.
And if they were lucky, one priest would say a quick spell over their chest cavity. Otherwise,
straight to wrapping. Historians still argue whether these shortcuts made a difference in the afterlife. Some believe the soul could still find peace if the basics were followed.
Others think skipping steps might leave you as a wandering spirit, floating around like a confused balloon at a birthday party you weren't invited to. And let's talk organs. If you were royalty, they'd remove your stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines, then carefully tuck them into jars guarded by the sons of Horus. They might just scoop everything out and toss it into a pit or leave it inside.
A few economy-class mummies were found with dried, unremoved innards.
Not ideal.
Especially in the heat. Then there's the brain. Oh yes, the iconic hook through the nose thing.
It did happen. But guess what?
Some lower-class mummies kept their brains.
Whether due to time constraints, lack of training, or apathy, the embalmers just sealed it all up and hoped for the best.
One particularly infamous mummy had a brain that baked into a sort of grey, shrunken pancake.
Still better than high school cafeteria pizza. Your face, though, that's important.
Even for you, the non-pharaoh, ancient Egyptians believed your soul would need to recognize your body to return.
So they might try to preserve your features with oil and linen, or slap on a painted mask made of cartilage, that ancient PPIMCH.
Mix of linen and plaster. No gold or jewels, just enough to say, "Hey, it's me.
Let me into the afterlife party." Meanwhile, the embalmers are working by torchlight.
Their tools are bone, bronze, or occasionally wood.
The room is cluttered with jars of strange pastes, pots of resin, and that one guy who always drops something when it's quiet.
Your limbs are stiffening, but they don't mind.
They're wrapping you like a falafel, your hands crossed over your chest, your mouth sealed shut with wax or resin.
No final words, just a final crust. As the wrappings build up, you begin to disappear, layer by layer. You're becoming more idea than person. The linen is scratchy, dipped in oils, and might have been stolen from temple donations.
It squeaks a little as they pull it tight.
Your body creaks in response, like old floorboards under too many memories. A few amulets might be slipped in if your family could afford them. A scarab for the heart.
Maybe an eye of Horus near your throat.
If not,
An extra knot in the linen and a whispered apology. Sorry, buddy.
maybe next life. Historians still debate how much faith the working class placed in these budget rituals.
Were they convinced it would work?
Or were they just hoping for the best, leaning on tradition and the faint promise that even a small offering might open a door somewhere beyond the veil?
Eventually, you're done.
Wrapped, sealed, bundled up like some spiritual to-go order. No parade.
No mourners.
Just your cousin grumbling about the price of funerary incense and someone misplacing your left sandal.
You won't be buried in a golden tomb.
You'll go into a communal shaft, side by side with 50 other souls who also didn't have the right bloodline. But still, you were mummified. You were ready, not because you were important, but because you were loved enough or feared enough to
Be preserved. And in ancient Egypt, that was enough to make you more than a corpse.
You're still lying there, stiff and swaddled, but the embalmers have moved on. Another body, another family, another round of awkward negotiations over what counts as adequate preparation for eternity. You'd think you'd be the center of attention, but you are quickly becoming just another linen bundle stacked. In the back,
Welcome to the afterlife assembly line. See, your embalmer isn't a holy man. He's not draped in ritual linen or glowing with divine purpose.
he's more like the town's least favorite Uncle Gruff, practical and slightly hungover. He knows the prayers by heart but doesn't say them unless someone's watching. And no offense, but your budget didn't cover an audience. The truth is, embalming wasn't just a sacred ritual, it was a trade.
These guys had guilds, toolkits, and sometimes questionable hygiene.
In Memphis and other major necropolises, some embalmers even passed down the trade through generations, which sounds sweet until you realize that means Junior was learning how to cut dead people before he could read. This embalmer,
He's got a knack for shortcuts. A little extra natron here. A faster wrapping method there.
one time, he used date syrup instead of resin because it was cheaper. The family never noticed though. The ants did.
He's also known to cut the corner of amulets so they fit better, which is embalmer code for I dropped it and broke it. Historians still argue whether these corner-cutting embalmers respected the soul's journey or simply cashed
In on cultural obligation, some said the lines between piety and profit were blurry.
Others believe these practices were just as spiritual, just with fewer gold trimmings. Still, this guy takes his role seriously.
In his own way,
He has his tools laid out neatly. Knives, scrapers, pots of unguents, and that long, scary brain hook.
But you already know he didn't use that on you.
whether that was mercy or laziness, we'll never know. Outside, your cousin is complaining again.
Something about how the coffin isn't finished and the painter never showed. He's thinking about carving your name into the wood himself right next to where someone else's name was clearly chiseled off. This happens more often than people admit.
Coffins were expensive, and death didn't wait for custom orders. Back inside, the embalmer starts cleaning up.
He has 3 more clients this week, and only one of them is paying full price.
That one gets real obsidian eye caps, a seed oil rinse, and maybe even a full eulogy.
You?
Well, the eulogy might be a 2-word grunt and a shrug, but even here, in this dusty backroom of the underworld, there are moments of strange tenderness.
Your embalmer pauses as he smooths the last layer of linen over your face. He mutters a short line, not a full prayer, but something close.
Maybe he's asking for forgiveness.
Maybe he's just hoping the gods aren't watching too closely. Tonight, then he reaches for the resin. This part matters. The resin seals everything like spiritual shellac.
It keeps out moisture, bugs, and bad memories.
The kind used on you probably came from a local tree, not the fancy imported stuff. Maybe it even smells a little sweet.
That would be a nice final note, if it weren't for the burnt meat aroma that still lingers in the air. The embalmer pours the thick, black goop over your wrappings.
It pours in the folds and hardens into a crust.
It looks a little like you've been dipped in toffee.
Honestly,
You could be mistaken for a weirdly shaped dessert, and once the resin hardens, that's it.
you're sealed in. No more changes. No edits. No upgrades. Whatever mistakes were made, missing amulets, skipped rituals, reused linens, they're now part of your eternity starter pack. Historians debate whether this final sealing was meant
To preserve the body or to trap the soul in place, locking it to the form.
Some say it was a practical step.
Others claim it had deeper magic.
No one's totally sure. You will move to a corner now, along with others like you.
a baker,
a scribe.
a child wrapped too quickly.
The embalmer labels each one with red ochre.
A quick scribble on the linen.
No full names, just roles or initials.
Your K3 male, 40 seconds, medium build. It's not exactly poetic, but it keeps things organized. Outside, the sun is starting to set. The embalmer sighs.
He lights a bit of incense, not for you, but to mask the smell.
He doesn't even look back as he leaves.
His day is done.
Yours, in a way, is just beginning. And here's the odd thing. You're not alone.
The workshop is full of these stories.
Hidden beneath layers of linen and oil are teachers, weavers, fishermen, wives, brothers, people who never ruled anything, but who were still mummified.
That's the twist.
Mummification wasn't just for kings. It was for anyone who could scrape together the coin and cared enough to try. Sometimes these efforts were genuine.
Families pooled money, sold heirlooms, begged temple scribes for a spare.
Spell.
Other times, people cut corners and hoped no one would notice.
And yet, for all the differences between your burial and that of a pharaoh, you share the same central hope, that this wrapping, these rituals, however humble, will carry you into eternity. It's strange comfort, really. You didn't have servants or scrolls or gold, but you had someone who remembered your name, even if just long enough to scrawl it in red pigment.
And in ancient Egypt, to be remembered even briefly was a kind of immortality. So now you wait. Not for glory or a grand procession, but for the slow drift of time,
For the tomb to close, for the next voice that might call you forward, whether in ritual or by accident, centuries from now. And when they do, you'll still be here quiet, wrapped, sealed, not royal, but still ready.
So here you are, tucked into your final wrappings.
Dried out like the world's saddest raisin, and sealed with a resin glaze that probably has bugs stuck in it.
But before anyone lays you to rest, there's one more step to figure out. What exactly did your family pay for?
See, there was a whole menu of mummification options in ancient Egypt, kind of like an afterlife buffet, but with a lot more internal organ removal. And you got the budget afterlife package. You didn't choose this.
It's not like there was a convenient sign outside the embalmer's hut listing silver tier 30 depends. Includes mask. Your relatives had to ask around, haggle, and
sometimes accept less than they hoped for.
Maybe someone told your brother that the standard package still got you into the field of reeds.
He probably believed it. Maybe he wanted to believe it. What did your budget package include?
Well, first, the natron bath. A full 40-day drying period was considered ideal, but if time or money ran short, some bodies only soaked for a couple of weeks.
You may still be a bit squishy. Let's call it medium rare. Then there's the issue of your organs. Ideally, they'd be removed, cleansed with palm wine, dried, and placed in beautiful canopic jars carved from alabaster or calcite.
You, however, might have had your organs wrapped and stuffed back into your body cavity, something called pseudo-embalming. It's like ordering a salad and having it handed back to you in a soggy paper bag. Now, did you get the coffin? Technically, yes.
But it's not custom-made.
It's a plain wooden box, probably reused, and definitely without your name painted in gold hieroglyphs. Some budget coffins were modular mass-produced and quickly painted over.
In fact, you're still
has traces of the previous owner's titles under a hasty coat of black paint.
Someone even forgot to change the name on the side panel.
You're now Pharaoh Amenemhet for eternity, but don't get too excited. He was dethroned after 6 months. Historians still argue whether such mistaken identities mattered in the spiritual realm. Did the gods see through the paint?
Or did they check the name tag and shrug, letting you pass through the celestial gates under false credentials?
But it's not just about materials, it's about the little rituals that should happen.
A proper
burial might include the opening of the mouth ceremony, a sacred act that let you breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife.
If your family couldn't afford a priest, they might ask a neighbor who once saw the ritual performed to wave a stick near your lips and mutter something vaguely priestish.
It's like asking your uncle to officiate a wedding because
he owns a robe and speaks loudly. Some families got creative.
They carved their own protective spells into scraps of wood or reused bits of temple scrolls as makeshift book of the dead excerpts.
Archaeologists have even found shopping list papyri repurposed into burial texts complete with grocery notes next to prayers for eternal life.
It's a strangely comforting image. The afterlife riding on the back of a reminder to buy lentils. And then there's the mask. The golden, serene death mask is the face we all imagine thanks to Tutankhamun. But you're
getting a cartilage version, a paste of linen and glue, molded to fit more or less, and painted with wide eyes and maybe a hint of a smile.
If they were generous, they added blue or red accents.
If they were rushed, it looks like a
theatre prop that got left out in the rain. Still, you have a face.
That counts. In Egyptian belief, recognition was important.
The Solar Bar had to recognize the body to reunite after death.
Even if the features were off, even if the mask was wonky, it symbolized that you were someone. You mattered, even. Your tomb, or rather, your spot in the group pit, is part of the economy afterlife.
You are not alone down there.
Bodies are stacked carefully but compactly, wrapped in similar linen, packed like spiritual sardines.
In some cases, wooden planks or reeds separated the bodies, but often there was no distinction.
You touched shoulders with strangers, some long dead before you, others buried the same week. These mass burials weren't sloppy.
They were a practical solution to the fact that most people couldn't afford individual tombs.
And they weren't without meaning. Even a shared burial could be sanctified with a priestly blessing, a shared offering bowl, and perhaps a carved
stela nearby listing names, most of which have long since faded into dust. Still, as you lie there, wrapped in budget linens, with your repainted mask and a spell scribbled on the back of an old receipt, you are by ancient Egyptian standards lucky, because not everyone got this.
Some were thrown into pits without rites.
Others left in the desert. Others buried to shallow, only to be unearthed by floods or animals.
You, at least, were mummified, however humbly.
You were intended for eternity, and in this culture, that intent mattered.
A lot. Historians still question how widely this belief
extended to the poor.
Did they feel the same spiritual urgency? Or was this about family pride, cultural norms, and hope more than certainty?
Whatever the answer, here you are, bundled and buried, waiting in the dark with the rest of the hopeful dead, and somewhere above you, life continues.
Children run past the necropolis, laughing.
A woman lights incense at a small roadside shrine.
A merchant counts coins, thinking about how much to set aside for his future burial. Everyone, rich or poor, is thinking about what happens when the last breath leaves and the linen comes out, because no matter how plain your coffin or rushed your rituals, the Egyptians believed in something rare, that the dead, all of them, deserved to be remembered, wrapped, and laid to rest with care, even you, especially you.
Your body's now fully wrapped and sealed, your face hidden behind a painted mask that vaguely resembles you if you squint, and maybe if you were having a good hair day in the afterlife.
You're packed tight into a modest coffin, nothing fancy,
and loaded into a communal burial chamber. Not much space, no golden furniture, and absolutely zero sphinxes guarding the doorway.
But you made it. You're entombed. And strangely, now the real decorating begins. See, for many Egyptians, not just royals, the wrapping itself was the most important display.
It didn't matter that you didn't get your own room with murals or a sarcophagus shaped like a god.
Your wrappings were your story.
Like ancient packaging design.
And the more elaborate, the better.
It wasn't uncommon for even lower-class mummies to be swaddled in dozens and dozens of linen strips, layered with a kind of obsessive care that made you wonder if they were making a mummy or a linen-based powder. Some mummies had over a mile
of linen on them.
That's right. Imagine being wrapped in the distance of 17 football fields of fabric. Even more ironic, the wealthiest people didn't always get the most wrappings. It was the middle and working classes, trying to overcompensate. If you couldn't afford gold leaf, maybe you could spring for 800 yards of used priest robes. This wrapping wasn't just for preservation, it was a visual message. Every layer could include spells, protective knots, sacred symbols, or amulets.
If your family couldn't afford the fancy charms, the embalmers might doodle one with ink on a linen square.
Not quite magical platinum status, but maybe it'd get noticed at the gates of the underworld. Now, here's a detail people rarely mention. Some of your linen wasn't clean. The embalmers reused cloth all the time. Temple donations, worn out. Priest garments, cast of household linens, nothing went to waste. In fact, forensic studies have found bits of embroidery, faded ink, and even fragments of old laundry marks on some mummy wrappings.
Yes, you may be headed for eternity wrapped in someone's napkin. Historians still argue about how intentional this recycling was.
Was it sacred, a form of offering?
Or just practical embalming economics? Did people care?
Or were they too focused on the symbolic power of being wrapped, regardless of what the linen used to be?
And it wasn't just cloth.
The positioning of your body mattered too.
Royal mummies were often arranged like Osiris, arms crossed, fingers
curled, head lifted slightly as if mid-thought.
You, though, might have a pose more like someone dropped a mannequin down a flight of stairs and just kept rapping. In crowded tombs, embalmers made space where they could.
Some mummies were bent at the knees, curled sideways, or even stacked vertically. There's one famous case of a group tomb in Deir el-Medina where several individuals were wrapped and stored sitting upright, leaning against the wall like ancient roommates who'd had a really bad weekend.
Functional? Yes.
Dignified?
Debatable. Still, the wrapping told its own story.
One mummy had a tiny amulet of a hedgehog clipped into the chest layer, likely a symbol of protection during rebirth.
Another had a crude drawing of a house, suggesting
someone hoped for shelter in the next world.
These were your family's little messages, slipped between folds of cloth and resin, hoping the gods would read between the lines, and the gods had a lot to read. Entire prayers were written in ink along the linen strips, like having a sacred cheat sheet tattooed across your whole body.
Other times, charms were wrapped strategically around vital areas, scarabs over the heart, Eye of Horus on the throat, tiny wax figures of gods tucked near the hands.
One poor soul was found with a wooden spoon amulet, presumably hoping the afterlife had stew. Of course, all of this took time. Skilled embalmers might wrap over the course of several days, letting each layer dry and harden before applying the next. But you
might have been wrapped in a single afternoon slapdash, overlapping, a few pieces hanging loose at the edges.
Maybe your left foot got more attention than the rest of you, because someone was training that day.
That's how things
went in the economy class afterlife. Uneven, imperfect, but still full of meaning. Historians still debate whether rush mummification undermined a person's soul journey.
Was speed a problem, or could intention override technique?
Some texts suggest that even hasty burials could succeed spiritually if the heart was in the right place, and ideally, also in the right jar. But you didn't get a jar. So, fingers crossed. Then again, what you did get was visibility. Even without a fancy tomb, your wrapping stood out. Some embalmers wrapped in geometric patterns, zigzags, diamonds, or even spirals.
It was as if they were saying, this one's not royal, but look how neat the corners are.
A few mummies were decorated with painted panels or resin inlays, even if the body inside was long gone or never properly dried. One wrapped form, discovered in a communal shaft, had a linen-covered face painted to resemble a smiling child, even
though the body underneath was an adult male. Was it a mistake, a reused mask,
or someone's final wish to be remembered with joy?
Even today, researchers are still unwrapping these stories, both figuratively and literally.
They x-ray the layers, analyze the folds, trace the old ink.
And sometimes beneath all those centuries of silence, they find a joke scribbled on the cloth, or a name no one's spoken in millennia. You never got a golden burial chamber or a private shrine.
But wrapped in miles of linen, you were still transformed.
Not into a king, not into a god, but into something just as powerful. A memory someone worked hard to preserve, and in ancient Egypt, that was more than enough.
The wrapping is finished. The resin has cooled into its hard, glassy crust.
You've been slotted into a shared tomb somewhere near the edge of town, far from the Valley of the Kings, far from any pyramid. But you're not alone, because right beside you, wrapped just as tightly, perhaps even more delicately, is a cat. Yes, that's right.
The neighbor in the next linen bundle over is a house pet. Or was once.
Probably. But in death, it may have ranked higher than you on the spiritual priority list. You see, while most people assume mummification was reserved for kings and queens, the truth is, animals in ancient Egypt often got the VIP treatment, especially if they were sacred or connected to gods.
Cats were linked to Bastet, ibises to Thoth, crocodiles to Sobek.
Entire species had spiritual job titles. And humans, well,
not all of you made the cut. This cat, let's call her Patches, may have had her own tiny sarcophagus.
Perhaps even painted eyes and jewelry around her neck.
Her linen is finer than yours. Her face mask
decorated in gold leaf. If you didn't know better, you'd think she ran the embalming shop in her spare time. Historians have found millions, yes, millions of animal mummies across Egypt. Entire catacombs packed floor to ceiling with felines, falcons, shrews, and snakes, each wrapped with care, each intended as an offering to a deity. Some were personal pets, others bred purely for sacrificial purposes.
There were animal mummy factories, industrial-scale operations where kittens were raised just to be embalmed and sold at temples.
A bit grim, if you're a cat person. Now, Patches here might not have belonged to anyone special.
She might have been donated to the temple by a merchant hoping to gain favor in the next life.
And yet, she was mummified with detail and devotion you,
well, frankly, didn't get. Historians still argue whether animals were seen as divine avatars or
spiritual messengers. Did they carry prayers to the gods?
Or were they merely ritual objects, like incense and bread?
Some scholars suggest elite pets received full funerary rites, including eulogies and offerings, while temple animals were mummified in bulk, quantity over quality. And speaking of bulk, you're packed into a shaft with about 30 other
bodies, human and non-human alike. On one side of you is a scribe, his hands still ink-stained, his body wrapped in orderly loops.
On the other, a baboon mummy, tied up so tightly it looks like a ball of socks.
You can't help but wonder who's getting more attention when the gods come calling. Some of these animal mummies came with accessories,
Golden collars,
engraved amulets, even tiny coffins with inscriptions.
Your coffin still has a Menem hat, scratched on the side in someone else's handwriting.
the baboon.
His name might be written in red ink along his snout. And while your book of the dead spell was probably borrowed from a neighbor's scroll, animals sometimes had their own inscriptions. Short prayers like, "May Bistet accept this offering,"
Or to Sobek, from his humble servant. Even more awkwardly, some animal mummies had names.
Cute ones.
Little Fierce, Mittens, or One Who Stole Chicken. You didn't get a nameplate. You got a hasty mark in ochre that's already fading, still. This whole tomb, this cluttered, stacked, sin-saturated room is humming with belief.
not just in gods and eternity, but in the idea that everything could have a place beyond death. If it was loved, or sacred, or useful, it could be preserved. Even bugs got in on the mummification action. Scarabs, for instance, were sacred, and often mummified or turned into amulets.
There's one case where a dung beetle mummy was wrapped in linen and placed in a teen's burial. Was it a pet?
A charm, or just a really lucky insect. Historians still debate whether these animal burials represented true reverence or religious industry. Some tombs show signs of mass production animals with no organs, or even empty linen bundles passed off as
Mummies.
The ancient equivalent of a souvenir shop scam. But others
show real care. Tiny sarcophagi carved with prayers, wrappings laid with surgical precision, animal eyes painted in bright coal, staring upward as if ready to leap into the stars. So, where does that leave you? You weren't a priest, you weren't a noble, and clearly you weren't sacred like our friend Patches.
But your body was still prepared. Someone paid for this. Someone somewhere cried when you died. Even if it wasn't enough for a private tomb, it was enough to give you this linen, oil, resin, and a resting place. And here's the comforting part.
In death, hierarchy softens.
A cat, a merchant, a scribe, and a soldier all lie together,
Wrapped in the same resin, hoping for the same journey. If anything, the presence of animal mummies made the afterlife feel more connected, more
lived in. Imagine entering the field of reeds not as a lonely soul, but surrounded by the scent of flowers and the purring of sacred cats.
Maybe the gods don't check your tax bracket. They just want to know if you showed up with reverence. That's
the secret the kings might have missed.
They had tombs guarded by curses and jackal-headed statues.
But here, in this pile of linen and silence, there's something more intimate. A shared belief that life, even the small, fur-covered, or underpaid,
Kind deserved memory. You and Patches aren't so different after all.
You're still sealed in linen and resin, tucked between a baboon and a nobleman's scribe, lying in a tomb shared with strangers and sacred animals alike. But here's the awkward truth. You might not even be in there. Not really, because for a
whole class of ancient Egyptians, those who died far from home, in poverty, in exile, or without family, actual mummification didn't always happen.
That's right.
Sometimes the body wasn't even present, and what was wrapped and buried in your place?
Well,
anything that could pass for you from the outside. You've become a symbolic mummy, a stand-in, a bundle of carefully wrapped items, made to trick the eyes of both the living and the dead. It sounds like a scam.
And in some cases, it kind of was.
But not always out of fraud or laziness.
Often, it came from necessity, grief, or superstition.
Maybe you died at sea. Maybe a caravan never returned.
Maybe disease made your body too unsafe or damaged for traditional rites.
But in a society that feared what happened to a soul without mummification, families improvised. They made token bodies effigies.
A sack of sand, bones from livestock, some pottery shards for organs, maybe a carved face or even a wooden spoon for a tongue.
Wrap it all up in linen, douse it with resin, whisper prayer, and lower it into the ground. Foil. Mummy. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was.
Some think it was common in rural areas, where embalming workshops were scarce.
Others argue that these bundles were more ceremonial, made not to deceive but to comfort.
A funeral for a person already gone.
A way to say goodbye when the body couldn't be found. But here's where things get a little weirder. Some of these false mummies were intentional and spiritual.
They weren't just substitutes.
They were ritual objects meant to absorb the soul from afar. The idea that the soul might wander home, see its symbolic body waiting, and settle into it like a hermit crab moving into a fresh shell. There's a famous case of a mummy-shaped bundle found with nothing human inside at all, just straw, feathers, and
fragments of a broken mirror. Was it symbolic? Deceptive? A child's memorial? No one knows.
But the linen was real. The prayers were there, and the resin had been applied just like on a real corpse. And then you get the really awkward ones. Fraudulent mummies. Embalmers, especially in overcrowded workshops, might have sold a full burial package but delivered something
less. One forensic study found a beautifully wrapped mummy that turned out to contain nothing but a single human foot, likely
reused from another burial. It was all linen. No person.so. Maybe that's you. Maybe you died too far from home. Maybe your family never retrieved the body.
Or maybe they couldn't afford the trip to the embalmer's quarter and settled for wrapping your walking stick, your favorite tunic, and a few dried flowers.
A gentle light hold in linen. But if that's true,
does it matter?
In ancient Egypt, intention carried weight. The spiritual world wasn't about biological identity, it was about ritual. If someone believed in you enough to wrap something, to paint a mask, to whisper your name while sealing the tomb, that energy might have been enough to draw your soul back home. This is why some false mummies included fake amulets made of mud or clay. Not to deceive, but to stand in for the real thing. A mud scarab still represented rebirth. A painted eye still called on Horus.
A carved wooden heart still stood before the scales of Mart, ready to be weighed against a feather. There's even
evidence that some families included written instructions for the gods tucked into the linen. This bundle represents X.
He was lost, but we remember him. These notes were heartfelt, not heretical.
They weren't trying to trick Anubis, they were just asking for mercy. Of course, there were also bundles that were 100% deception.
The equivalent of selling fake tickets to the afterlife. Some embalmers reused coffins, double stuffed tombs,
or filled up wrappings with sand and ash just to fulfill a contract.
Grave robbing wasn't always done by strangers. Sometimes it happened before the burial, and that means somewhere out there, your real body might have been discarded, buried shallowly, or even left unwrapped.
It's a painful idea, one that archaeologists uncover again and again. Mismatched bones, disturbed graves, anonymous remains tucked into wall crevices or sand drifts, too fragmented to be identified. But you, this linen bundle, you still exist.
Someone went through the motions. Someone thought it was worth faking, because not being mummified was too terrifying to accept. The Ode unpreserved in ancient Egypt was to risk oblivion.
Your soul might be lost, your spirit hungry, your essence unable to find peace. So even a
fake body was better than none. It was a beacon, a placeholder, a spiritual flare shot into the unknown, and there's something oddly moving about that. That someone, somewhere, cared enough to wrap cloth around a memory.
To mimic sacred rites with no budget, no tours, and no body.
That's not deception, that's devotion dressed as theta.so. If you're a fake mummy, a symbolic husk, a bundle
of linen meant to look like a person, don't feel bad. The afterlife is still open to you. Because in this culture, belief made things real.
If someone believed in your journey, your passage, your rebirth, then the universe might just let
it happen. You might never have been royalty.
You might not even be human, but someone once wrapped you with care, and that means everything.
You're lying still, silent, swaddled in linen like a forgotten gift, but something's missing. It's not the embalming oils or the gilded coffin or even your organs. It's your name, that's right. Your name, the core of your soul's identity. The thing that makes you, you for eternity, is nowhere to be found. Maybe it was never written. Maybe it was once scratched on a wooden tag. now long decayed.
Or maybe it was washed off by floodwater, scratched out by tomb robbers, or never known by the archaeologist who unearthed your dusty linen bundle 3,000 years later. You've become what scholars politely call an anonymous mummy.
In ancient Egyptian culture, that's not just a minor clerical error, it's a spiritual disaster.
Without your name preserved in writing, there's a very real risk that your soul self, won't find its way back.
You might hover forever
in the liminal zone, a kind of divine, lost and found, unlabeled, uncatalogued, and deeply confused, and you wouldn't be alone. Most Egyptian mummies were not royal, not rich, not well documented.
They were farmers, artisans, servants,
soldiers.
Their tombs weren't carved with hieroglyphs or stocked with gold.
Some were little more than mass burials, communal graves shared by dozens or even hundreds of people, all sealed beneath a few feet of stone and sand. Historians still debate just how many of these anonymous mummies were given full burial rites.
Was a priest present?
Were the right spells read aloud?
Or was it a quick rap, a group prayer, and down into the pit they went?
You might had a name once. Perhaps Jetty, the washer of linens.
Or Back, apprentice to a carpenter.
It could have been recorded on a papyrus scroll that's now ashes.
Or painted on a wooden mask lost in a flood. Maybe someone whispered it as they tied the final knot on your wrappings.
But that whisper doesn't echo far, and even if your name was written, it might have been lost because of something as petty as economics.
Tomb paintings cost money.
So did inscriptions. So did custom coffins, professional scribes, pigment, and gilded amulets.
For a lot of people, the name never made it past the oral tradition. That's why archaeologists have found entire tomb shafts filled with dozens of unnamed individuals, wrapped similarly, laid in rows, their only identity being their placement, the one near the north wall, or the tall mummy with a red shroud. Some had linen scraps with scribbled writing. Sure, but those notes often read things like beloved of Osiris or for the journey.
Beautiful sentiments.
Not legal IDs, and if you were unlucky, your name was removed on purpose. You might have been disgraced in life. Maybe you betrayed your temple, or supported the wrong side in a civil dispute. Maybe you were a priest who angered the pharaoh.
Or maybe you just owed the wrong nobleman a bit too much grain.
Whatever the reason, your name was damned, struck from the record. That's right, ancient cancel culture was real.
Your name might have been scraped off your coffin, burned from papyrus records, even chiseled off temple walls. Pharaoh Akhenaten's name was famously attacked after his religious revolution.
His tomb inscriptions were vandalized,
his images smashed, his memory denied. You, however, didn't need to start a monotheistic uprising to get the same treatment. It could have taken just one angry relative.
Or corrupt embalmer who sold your coffin to someone richer and tossed your identity in the trash. And once that name is gone, well, you're in spiritual limbo.
According to Egyptian belief, the name was more than a label, it was a lifeline.
Without it, the soul couldn't be summoned, honored, or fed in the afterlife. Yet here's a strange, hopeful twist. Sometimes later generations reassigned names to nameless mummies. They'd give the body a generic title like the Silent
One, or He Who Rests with I.
It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a placeholder until the real name could be known again. That's how some archaeologists today refer to anonymous mummies. Not as unknowns, but as temporarily unnamed. It's a small kindness.
A nod to the idea that someone, somewhere, once loved this person, knew this person, mourned them. In a way, the mere act of talking about you now, here in this script, is a form of resurrection.
Your story is being remembered, and even without a name, you're being seen, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough to wake your bar, wherever it's floating. Maybe it'll hear this, feel the stir of memory, and remember that it once walked through sunlit fields, wore sandals made of palm fiber, and drank barley beer with friends. And he might even smile at the idea that people in the future are still
fascinated by it. That thousands of years later, someone is still wondering, who was this person?
What did they dream about?
Did they have a dog?
Did they complain about sand in their lunch?
There's comfort in knowing that, even without royal tombs or cold masks, you're still part of a story.
Your linen-wrapped body might lie nameless in a museum drawer or buried under meters of sand, but your humanity or personhood hasn't been lost. Maybe one day, your real name will be found, scratched faintly on a linen tag buried beneath your shoulder, or encoded in a forgotten scroll in a desert cache. And when that happens, someone will say it aloud, and just maybe, your soul will finally get to stretch, blink, and whisper, "Ah, there I am. You'd think the afterlife would at least come with some new digs, right? A private tomb, a polished sarcophagus, a spot in the shade with a nice view of the Nile. Sorry,
Not in your price range. Instead, welcome to the timeshare economy.
of ancient Egypt, where your eternal resting place was probably someone else's first dot. It starts like this. You die. Your family, not exactly rolling in depends of silver, takes your body to a tomb they have access to.
But it's not new.
It's been used before, maybe by a distant ancestor, maybe by a stranger, maybe multiple strangers.
They lift a stone slab, lower you into a shaft that smells like old resin and damp limestone, and place you gently next to the other occupants. Someone scoots over a bit to make room.
Probably, tomb reuse wasn't just tolerated, it was expected for most of the non-elite. Historians still argue whether this was purely economic or whether there were spiritual justifications, like sharing a space with one's ancestors or joining a community of the dead. Either way, second-hand tombs were standard practice by the late period and Greco-Roman times, and it gets weirder. You know that beautiful wooden coffin you saw in the workshop window last week? The one with bright blue eyes and inscriptions that say "Beloved of Hathor." You didn't get that one, but you might be in that one because someone scraped off the old owner's name, painted yours on top if they even bothered, and hoped no one would notice. This was coffin recycling, and it happened a lot, especially during times of national chaos, like after the collapse of centralized rule or during foreign occupations.
Tombs were looted, coffins yanked from walls, mummies dumped unceremoniously so their containers could be sold again. You might be resting in a box meant for a high priest named Jennifer, whose family fled and never returned.
Or maybe the original
owner had their name cursed and erased, leaving the box conveniently available for your funeral discount. Sometimes embalmers got sneaky.
A new layer of plaster would be applied over the old inscriptions, a fresh paint job slapped on top, and voila, new coffin. Just don't look too close at the base, where the old name still peeks out like a ghost trying to clear its throat. It wasn't just the coffins either.
Shabby figurines, which were meant to serve you in the afterlife, were often reused with scratched-of names.
So were amulets, beads, even burial linens.
There are documented cases of bandages being turned inside out so the old writing wouldn't show. Hey, reduce, reuse, recycle, just with a little more mummified elbow grease. And then there's the ultimate indignity. You yourself might be the
recycled one. You see, embalmers were sometimes pressured by time, politics, or plain old laziness.
In Celtic periods, think war, famine, or regime change, they might mummify bodies in batches.
Some were never claimed,
others improperly labeled.
And when storage got tight, shuffle the bodies around, take the better preserved one, and give it a quick upgrade. A new mask, a new name, a fresh spell carved on the footboard. Your body, in other words, might have been repurposed for someone else's identity. A wealthy family might adopt your mummy to pose as their last uncle, or a priest might repurpose your remains to honor a benefactor. No DNA tests, no facial reconstructions, just a linen-wrapped shrug and the phrase, "He will serve I well." You're still trying to process that when you hear the stone above your tomb grind open again. Another arrival. Turns out, even in death, you're still the new guy in the shared apartment.
No Wi-Fi, but the rent's eternal. You glance over well.
You would if your eyelids weren't sealed with resin and sense the shape of the person next to you.
Their wrappings are older, flaking. Their mask is cracked.
They smell faintly of cinnamon and myrrh. Nice. At least someone sprung for deluxe spices. You start to wonder how many of you are stacked in here. 10,
20,
100.
At sites like Saqqara and Deir el-Bersha, archaeologists have found shafts
crammed with up to hundreds of bodies, each added over decades, sometimes centuries.
Layers of lives, all squashed together like a very patient game of Jenga. And just when you think it can't get more cramped, someone drops in a dog mummy. Or a jar of pickled ibis, because animal burials were common in group tombs too,
especially in later periods when animal cults were booming.
So now you've got a feathered roommate. Historians still debate how people felt about this. Did families grieve the loss of exclusivity?
Or was sharing a tomb seen as bonding?
Did people leave room for future relatives? Or was it first come, first sealed? You will never know.
But you do know that somewhere above, the desert wind howls over an empty stela where your name might have been. Sand gathers in the cracks.
A passing archaeologist glances at the tomb map and notes, chamber for B. Mixed remains, multiple periods, no names, just layers, still You find a strange comfort in it. You are not alone, not in this afterlife, not in this dusty silence.
You're part of a collective now, a choir of forgotten voices, sleeping side by side under stone and time, and when someone someday opens the tomb again, flashlight flickering, gloves pulling back linen with delicate reverence, maybe
Maybe they'll whisper something. Who are you?
and though you have no mouth, no throat, no proper coffin somewhere in the threads of linen and memory, your answer might rise. I was someone. The tomb is sealed, the linen wrapped.
Tight, the embalming complete. But hold on before you drift too far into your budget afterlife. You might want to check your accessories, because while royalty got glittering golden scarabs and bespoke charms carved by temple artisans, you got something a little more
Mass-produced. Welcome to the world of DIY amulets and of the wreck spells, where not all protective magic is created equal. Let's take a look at your chest amulet. For instance,
It's supposed to be a powerful symbol, maybe an Eye of Horus or an ankh blessed in a purification ceremony, inscribed with your name and a sacred phrase like, "May he live again in peace." Instead, what you've got is a small piece of faience, possibly chipped, possibly fake, with someone else's name half scratched out and yours scribbled over it. If they remembered, you squint well. Imagine squinting and notice the carving isn't quite right. The lines wobble. The ankh looks more like a wonky pretzel.
that's because it was made in bulk, probably in some clay mold churned out by embalmers' assistants who weren't paid enough to care about aesthetics. Historians still argue whether the artisans believed these amulets needed to be precise to work, or if the mere idea of protection was good enough for the underfunded.
Dead?
It's like printing a coupon with the expiration date smudged. Technically it counts, but try using it at checkout. And then there are your spells. The elite got full books of the dead, beautifully illustrated, handwritten on papyrus in neat hieratic script.
These books were personalized, carefully tailored with the dead person's name, their deeds, and the specific challenges they might face in the afterlife.
Crocodile attack at the River of Knives. Covered.
Need to convince Osiris you never cheated.
On a grain teller.
There's a spell for that. You, on the other hand,
You got a papyrus scrap, if you were lucky, with generic lines lifted straight from someone else's book.
in fact, some burial texts from lower class tombs are literally template copies. Blank spaces left where your name was supposed to be filled in.
Spoiler alert. Sometimes they forgot .so. Now you're floating through the dew at the Egyptian underworld with
A scroll that says something like, "Hail, I am. Insert name. I have not stolen.
I have not killed.
I have not."
Done that other bad thing. Imagine showing up at the Divine Judgment Hall with a crumpled IKEA instruction manual and no idea where the Allen key is. Let's not forget your heart scarab. This chunky beetle-shaped talisman was supposed to stop your heart from testifying against you during the weighing of the heart.
A quality one would have a full spell from chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead, pleading, "O my heart,
Do not stand.
against me as a witness, do not tell lies about me in the presence of the great God."
Yours might just say, "Good luck," or worse, it's blank. Embalmers were known to skip inscriptions when clients couldn't afford them.
Some even reused scarabs from previous burials, erasing the original writing.
And as for sacred resin, sometimes it was just melted pitch mixed with animal fat.
You're wrapped in DIY aromatherapy, but you know what?
It's kind of
Charming. There's a rugged honesty to your afterlife kit.
Each trinket tells a story not of wealth, but of effort. Your family might have haggled in the market for that amulet. Maybe your cousin copied your spell from a wall painting by torchlight.
Maybe someone held your hand as the final charm was.
Tie it to your chest, whispering, "It's not perfect, but it's yours, and you're not alone in this patchwork journey."
Archaeologists have found entire tombs filled with standardized amulets, mass-produced in local workshops.
During the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, demand for these protective objects surged.
Cheap figurines of Osiris, Thoth, Bastet, they were sold like good luck charms at the corner stall.
You bought what you could and hoped it worked. Even animals got in on the action.
The ibis mummies from Saqqara, many were wrapped with amulets, to some real, some clay dummies shaped like amulets. The idea, apparently, was that symbolic presence mattered more than authenticity. Historians still debate whether the ancient Egyptians truly believed that.
Even poor quality or fake objects held magic, or if it was more about following tradition. Keeping up appearances.
Either way, they went to great lengths to make sure everyone, even you, had something. A scarab, a spell,
a shot at eternity, and just maybe. The gods weren't sticklers for penmanship. You float now, wrapped in bandages reused from an older burial,
clutching a slightly cracked eye of Horus.
a faded spell lies tucked against your side. The ink has bled.
The papyrus is brittle, but it's there dot in the distance. A gate appears guarded by a lion-headed deity who demands your name, your titles, your sacred passwords. You open your mouth metaphorically and speak. Your amulet hums faintly against your chest. The gate swings open just a little, and you think, maybe, just maybe, that half-smudged spell was good enough after all. You're not exactly elite. We've established that.
But tonight, you're about to discover something even more humbling than your second-hand amulet. You're
not alone in this whole process, not by a long shot.
Welcome to the Neighborhood Embalming Club, where preservation is a group activity, and your eternal future depends a little too much on how busy the local mortuary is. You wake, or let's
say, you become vaguely aware on a reed mat inside a dark, buzzing workshop. The smell of resin hangs thick in the air. It's warm, but not cozy warm.
More like they left the stove on next to a vat of boiling oils warm.
Around you, other bodies are in various stages of being handled, padded, drained, stuffed, and wrapped. Some are missing limbs, some are missing faces.
You suddenly get the sense that things are being done
in bulk, because here's the thing. Mummification in ancient Egypt wasn't always some divine ceremony conducted in serene temples by white-robed priests chanting hymns to Anubis. Nope. In many cases, it was handled like a local business kind of like a dry cleaner. But with more entrails and fewer coupons, archaeologists have uncovered these embalming centers, places like Saqqara and Abydos, where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies were processed simultaneously. They had assembly
lines, stations,
work tables, drainage trenches. Honestly, it's impressive. You could get your organs removed, your body dehydrated with natron, and your wrapping started all in the same room. Historians still argue whether clients chose embalming tiers like some ancient mortuary menu: bronze, silver, gold packages, but the evidence strongly suggests there were options.
Couldn't afford the deluxe treatment with 40 days in natron, aromatic resins, and a sculpted death mask.
No worries.
You got the express service. 10 days in the cheap sort, a few prayers,
and some animal glue to hold it all together.
No judgment, except eternal. You might not even have had a coffin of your own.
Instead, your family or whoever showed up with your stiff, already leaking self might have paid for a shared embalming process, bundled you together with others, and hoped the gods weren't too picky. Now let's talk shop.
The neighborhood
embalming crew wasn't exactly run by monks.
These were practical people, skilled and overworked, often very creative with materials. Out of frankincense, mix in some tree sap and hope no one notices.
Low on natron,
use less and wrap tighter.
Need to make a body look fuller? Stuff it with sawdust, onions, or no-joke mud. You become a lumpy ancient piata. Even worse, sometimes these embalmers weren't exactly honest.
There are records, ancient papyri, real ones that describe legal disputes between grieving
families and dishonest embalmers. You said my uncle would get cedar oil and gold leaf, and instead, he smells like goat fat and is missing a toe.
Classic bait and switch. One scroll from the late period even describes inspectors making rounds to verify that the embalming ingredients matched what families paid for.
So, you see, even in the ancient world, you had to watch for upselling.
Next time someone offers you divine resin infusion, maybe ask what's in the jar. Let's say your family went with a middle-tier embalming service. You got some time in real natron, some decent resin rubdowns, and a little ceremony maybe. Just enough to convince your neighbors you had the good stuff. That public ritual
might happen right in front of the shop, with a curtain hung between you and the donkey tied out front.
Not ideal.
But hey, at least you got some incense. And what about the embalmers themselves? You'd imagine them
to be these cold, stoic craftsmen, but in truth, they were likely somewhere between community undertakers and holy technicians. They knew the prayers, they knew the recipes,
and they probably knew how to get a stain out of linen. Some might have had formal training. Others, apprentices who learned by doing. On you, still, the process had structure. Many workshops had designated house of purification rooms where bodies were cleaned.
Then you'd be moved to the place of embalming for all the messy stuff.
Finally, if your family shelled out a few extra depends, you'd be taken to the place of beauty, where your final wrappings, mask, and amulets were applied kind of like ancient mortuary clam-up, and don't forget the rituals.
Even the
Cheapest services included something symbolic, a whispered spell, a blessing, maybe a tiny statue tucked into your linens.
It wasn't all commerce.
there was meaning too,
Something sacred in the repetition, in the faith that it all mattered.
that your body deserved some reverence, even if it was done with bulk bought bandages and not so sacred oils. Now, try to imagine this embalming center during festival season.
Dozens of families show up all at once, each bringing their dead wrapped in mats or linen bundles.
The embalmers are swamped. Mistakes happen.
Someone gets the wrong tag.
A hand gets misfiled.
You're wrapped in someone else's linen and nobody notices. You could end up buried with another family's Shabty dolls. And spoiler alert, you might even get the wrong name tag on your toe. But weirdly, it works.
Because this was about more than luxury or individual fame.
In the eyes of many ancient Egyptians, the very act of preservation, even done imperfectly, was what mattered most. You got mummified. You were part of the ritual. You were remembered, if only by a whisper, and somewhere in that cluttered little embalming room, surrounded by incense smoke, reused tools, and overworked hands, you became part of something older than yourself, maybe not royalty,
but definitely a mummy. The light's figurative ones, of course, dim further as we glide into the darker, messier corners of the mummification world.
You're lying quietly in your bundle of linen and resin, and you're starting to feel like
something is off. That leg doesn't feel like yours. Wait, is that your leg? Well, we've got news.
there's a not so slim chance that your body isn't entirely your own anymore. See, ancient Egyptian embalming wasn't always the meticulous, reverent process that schoolbooks love to describe.
Especially if you weren't royalty, or even middle
class.
And especially if you died during a busy season, yes, those existed, or your embalmers were underpaid and overworked.
Because in those situations, body parts got mixed up.
A lot. Archaeologists have uncovered startling evidence from communal tombs and embalming workshops that suggests a dirty little secret. Sometimes, during mass mummifications, embalmers swapped or mixed human remains. Arms, legs, even skulls could
be separated and reassembled like ancient Mr. Potato Heads. Now, historians still argue whether this was due to pure sloppiness, ritualistic reasons, or economic corner cutting.
But the outcome was the same. You may not have been buried with all your original parts.
and those extras.
Let's just say the gods probably didn't do a head count dot in one mummy from the Saqqara necropolis. Researchers discovered a fully wrapped, apparently intact figure until X-rays showed the left leg had been replaced with two shorter femurs from two different people.
A patchwork job.
Which, honestly, is a little bit Frankenstein and a whole lot of no one's getting their deposit back. Even more disturbingly, some mummies weren't even complete bodies at all, just a torso and a mask.
Or bones arranged to look like a full person from the outside.
Sometimes embalmers wrapped sticks or pottery shards into the linens to maintain the body's shape when limbs were missing. This was likely done with the belief, or at least the hope, that appearance was enough to trick the gods. Or at least, the family.it wasn't always a scam, per se.
Sometimes it was desperation.
Other times, symbolic substitution. If a limb was lost or damaged, maybe eaten by a crocodile, or mangled in war, it could be replaced ritually, using wood or animal bone as a stand-in. The idea was that the soul would recognize itself, even if the flesh didn't quite match.
A divine close enough. You shift slightly mentally, of course, since you're already tightly bound, and try not to think too hard about that creaky elbow.
Is it yours?
Your cousin's.
That guy who owed your uncle 3 jars of beer.
This was also a side effect of mass production. In larger necropolises like Thebes, embalming centers had to process dozens of bodies at a time, especially after plagues, battles, or festivals where sacrifices were involved.
Identifying markers like toe tags, name bands, or coffin.
Inscriptions weren't always carefully maintained.
Linen got reused, tools were shared, and the line between your arm and someone else's arm got blurred. Let's pause to appreciate the sheer logistics of this operation.
Your body
Was washed, packed with natron for dehydration, then unpacked, re-oiled, reassembled, and wrapped.
in theory, someone was keeping track of each step.
But when several bodies are going through the same assembly line, mistakes are inevitable.
It's not hard to imagine a distracted apprentice grabbing the wrong femur from a drying rack. Hoops.
Eternal limb swap. Some embalmers even cut corners intentionally.
If a family only paid for a partial embalming, say, torso, and head preservation they might just discard or reassign the unused parts. A hip bone here, a rib there.
Eventually, a whole other mummy could be cobbled together from leftovers.
Yes, Frankenstein mummies existed centuries before Mary Shelley ever put pen to paper, and we haven't even gotten to the mummies with extra parts.
One analysis of a high-status mummy revealed 3 right arms neatly wrapped inside the linens, presumably stuffed in to preserve shape and symmetry.
Either no one noticed, or no one cared. But here's where things get even weirder. Sometimes, this bodily mix-up wasn't just tolerated, it was ritually accepted. In ancient Egyptian belief, especially among lower classes, the appearance of completeness sometimes mattered more than actual anatomical correctness. If a body looked whole, that was enough to carry the soul to the afterlife. So if an embalmer
Had to make a last-minute substitution to preserve your form?
well, they might have done it out of spiritual courtesy, not fraud, and in cases where the real body had been lost entirely, say, to fire, flood, or hungry animals' families, could request a proxy mummy. These were wrapped bundles made to resemble a real person, often containing symbolic items, bones, sand, pottery, or even nothing at all. Just the appearance of a mummy was enough to ensure the soul could be remembered. This might sound absurd
To modern minds trained to value medical precision and individual identity.
but for ancient Egyptians, the boundary between body and spirit was more fluid. The Ka and Ba, the soul's twin aspects, could recognize symbolic stand-ins, especially if they were blessed properly and placed with respect. Of course, none of
This would comfort you right now, lying there with someone else's wrist bones curled around your chest. But then again, maybe those bones belong to someone kind.
Maybe the two of you are heading into the afterlife together, a stitched-together tag team, ready to face judgment with all the grace that misplaced fibulas can offer. Why now? The resin
Has set, the linens are tight, and your new patchwork body is almost beautiful in its completeness.
Sure, it's a little collaborative, but isn't that what the afterlife's all about?
In death, as in life, you were part of something larger than yourself, even if that something included 3 left ankles and a mystery jaw. You blink, but only in your imagination, because your eyelids were glued shut with resin days ago. There's a strange silence around you now, muffled through layers of linen, dust, and centuries.
You think you've finally found peace, but unfortunately, peace isn't always guaranteed in the afterlife.
Especially when politics are involved. Because here's something you didn't plan for when you died. You might not be forgotten by accident. You might be forgotten on purpose. See, not every mummy was lost to time because of poverty or obscurity.
Some were erased, vilified, and buried in disgrace because of who they were or what they believed.
Welcome to the brutal intersection of power, rebellion, and cursed anonymity. Let's say you weren't just any commoner, you were part of a movement. Maybe you questioned the pharaoh's divine right, or maybe you supported the wrong faction during a civil dispute. Either way, if the winds of politics turned against you, so did your chances of a dignified eternity. In ancient Egypt, being remembered was everything. Names were spoken in rituals, written on tomb walls, carved into amulets.
That's how the soul stayed alive in the afterlife. But if your name was erased, scratched off a stele, burned from a papyrus, chipped off your sarcophagus, you were doomed to fade from existence.
This was called damnatio memoriae, and it was very much a thing. Long before the Romans coined the term, historians still argue whether some name wipings were acts of vengeance or simply practical real estate reuse. Either way, the result was chilling. To be unnamed was to be unmade. Take the infamous case of Pharaoh Akhenaten's followers.
After his death, his entire religious reform worshipping a single god, Aten, was scrapped, and his statues were
Smashed, his temples dismantled.
The people who served him,
Many of them met a similar fate.
their tombs were sealed, their names obliterated.
Some were never mummified at all, their bodies buried hastily, without rites.
Others were mummified, yes, but hidden so deeply, or buried so anonymously, that they became archaeological whispers. Or how about tomb robbers? Not the ones breaking in, but the ones buried there.
Some mummies were former thieves, caught and
Executed, then hastily wrapped and dumped far from sacred ground.
their embalmings were rushed, incomplete. No amulets, no book of the dead spells, just sought in nature, and the hope no one noticed.
Their punishment? No memory, no honor, no name, and
Then there are the political casualties, advisors, generals, priests once powerful, then suddenly dangerous.
if a new regime took over, Your alliances became liabilities. A scribe might be unwrapped in public, posthumously shamed. A priest might be dug up and reburied with pigs, literally.
One priest's tomb in Abydos showed signs of desecration.
The coffin smashed, the name gouged out, and a fresh inscription above it reading, essentially, "Here lies a traitor." Brutal, yes,
but also deeply symbolic.
In ancient Egypt, the body wasn't just a shell, it was a vessel for eternal life.
It was to damage the soul's vehicle.
So breaking your nose post-mortem,
that was a cosmic mugging. And if they went a step further, burn the remains, disassemble the mummy, or cast it into the river, your car and bar wouldn't be able to find each other again.
You'd become an eternal exile. Now picture this. You were just a low-level priest, doing your job, worshipping a god that was later declared obsolete. You die thinking everything's fine. You're mummified, buried with care, and then, decades
later, your tomb is found, your name is unfamiliar, and suddenly you're a liability to the narrative.
A few chisel strikes later, your identity is gone.
Just another anonymous mummy in a sea of linen. There's even a fringe theory, though it's
debated that some commoner mummies are actually disgraced royals, stripped of titles and buried without markers.
A way to quietly dispose of failed pharaohs, ambitious half-brothers, or queens who dared too much.
After all, who would suspect that the unmarked bundle buried beneath a fishmonger's house once ruled a kingdom? But of course, not every erased mummy was a villain or a rebel.
Some were victims of bureaucratic messiness.
During periods of chaos, war, famine, dynasty change, records were lost, tombs were plundered, identities dissolved like sugar in our water.
A scribe forgets to inscribe a name. A coffin is sold to someone else. A mummy gets shuffled in the rush and suddenly we're lost.
Not hated, not cursed,
just misfiled for eternity. And then there are the so-called ghost tombs, spaces with
signs of burial, but no bodies, or with bodies and no names. Were these people never mourned?
Were they buried in secret?
Or are they deliberate absences, a way to hide someone the regime wanted to erase, but didn't dare destroy?
You, wrapped tightly in your linen cocoon, begin to realize how precarious memory really is. That forever is a tricky thing. It depends on politics, on paperwork, on whether someone decided your name deserved to be said aloud every now and then. But even if your name was erased, your story isn't. Not completely.
Archaeologists now use scans, chemical analysis, and good old-fashioned detective work to piece identities back together.
Teeth tell origin.
Linen patterns reveal workshops.
Resin composition hints at class. Maybe someone finds you, centuries later, and gives you a number,
a label,
a story. It's not your real name, but it's a start. And maybe, just maybe, someone speaks it aloud on a quiet YouTube video, in the dark, late at night, and maybe that's enough to stir the car. Just a little. You stir gently in your
burial wrappings, figuratively, of course, because the linen's stiff with resin and about 800 years of bad decisions.
You're not in the golden tomb you'd hoped for.
There's no painted ceiling of stars, no boat for your soul to sail across the night sky.
Instead, you're here,
in a pit,
in the dirt,
surrounded by strangers. So let's talk about where you were actually buried and why it's nowhere.
Near the sacred ground you were promised. Despite what the museum dioramas like to suggest, not every ancient Egyptian rested in a magnificent tomb carved into limestone cliffs.
Those were for the upper crust, the pharaohs, high priests, wealthy scribes, and maybe a few lucky wives with connections.
But most mummies were not royal, not rich, and definitely not wrapped in divine protection. Your resting place.
It's more of a mass grave with a marketing problem.
Sure, it might have been called a necropolis, a city of the dead, but don't let the fancy Greek word fool you.
The real estate out here is cheap, dry, and crowded. If you're picturing a field of peaceful sand dunes,
try instead of dirt.
Lot with stacked bodies, crumbling bones, and some ambitious rodents with no respect for sacred traditions. These weren't tombs.
They were shafts, pits, crevices, sometimes reused and sometimes never meant for human remains in the first place.
And into them went workers, servants, villagers, anyone without the coin or clout to arrange better. Sometimes you were buried with a handful of personal items, sometimes not even that. And let's be honest, your wooden coffin, if you had one,
probably cracked within the first century.
The termites knew a good thing when they smelled it. The sad truth, these burial grounds were sometimes just old trash pits repurposed as cemeteries.
Archaeologists have unearthed layers of mummified bodies interspersed with broken pottery, fish bones, and domestic waste.
It's a little humbling. being laid to rest beside someone's kitchen scraps. Hope you weren't sensitive about that in life. Still, even these rough and tumble burials had their rules.
For example, orientation mattered.
Bodies were often placed with heads toward the west where the sun set, symbolizing the journey into the afterlife. Did that apply to you?
Maybe,
If the embalmers had time.
if they cared. But during plague years or political upheaval, bodies were dumped en masse, with little thought to placement, dignity, or decomposition timelines. Some of the bodies weren't even fully mummified, just dried out by the desert, and wrapped quickly to look like the real deal.
It was mummification by suggestion.
Wrap it tight enough, and maybe no one notices that you skipped the internal organ removal. Of course, the wealthy had entire valleys reserved for them, like the famous Valley of the Kings, with hidden corridors and cursed doors.
But
You're part of what modern scholars politely call non-elite burial populations. That's a very nice way of saying buried wherever there was room, a slope behind someone's house, a dry well, a communal shaft that doubled as a wine cellar the rest of the year. And here's where it gets even cozier. You weren't buried alone. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of others were packed in with you.
bodies layered like books in a forgotten library.
Limbs tangling, linens blending.
Some researchers even found instances where people were accidentally mummified together, creating what can only be described as the most uncomfortable ancient group hug in history. Now, one might think that such an undignified burial would doom your soul, right? No tomb carvings, no funerary spells, no golden trinkets.
But ancient Egyptians, at least those without deep pockets, developed workarounds.
Some had their names painted in ink on shrouds.
Others used small, affordable amulets mass-produced.
But still meaningful. And still others relied on family members to whisper their name each year during the Feast of the Valley, hoping a few syllables could make up for a lack of architecture. Historians still argue whether these modest burials actually hindered the
journey to the afterlife. Some claimed that the ritual, no matter how humble, was enough.
Others say that without the full package, spells, statues, scrolls, you just wander.
Lost, unfulfilled, maybe turned into a ghost that haunted the margins of memory. And speaking of ghosts, some of these non-elite cemeteries are downright eerie. At a site called Vagiel Gamus, yes, real name, archaeologists uncovered thousands of mummies, many unnamed, many weirdly well preserved, with signs of illnesses, injuries, and the occasional attempt at DIY mummification gone wrong.
No royal inscriptions, no golden masks,
just regular people hoping for a slice of eternity, even if it came with cracked bones and grieved neighbors who snored. Occasionally, someone got lucky.
Their burial might survive looters, flash floods, and insect infestations.
Maybe their name, scrawled in ink on a linen scrap, held on just long enough to be rediscovered. And maybe, just maybe, someone lit a candle in a modern museum and whispered, "This is Neferset, daughter of the baker. That counts. That really counts." And now,
archaeologists are realizing just how vital these non-royal mummies are.
they're the majority, the silent voices of everyday Egypt. By studying them, we learn about real lives, what people ate, what they worked as, what diseases they suffered, what charms they clutched in their final days. It turns out your humble,
dusty, overcrowded burial ground holds just as many stories as a pharaoh's gilded tomb.
maybe even more, because let's face it, the pharaohs were buried to be remembered. But you were buried hoping someone might remember one day, and now someone has. You're starting to settle into your linen-wrapped existence now. The resins
hardened around your face like a strange eternal hug, and the scent somewhere between ancient pine sap and foot powder has finally faded into the background. But let's not pretend it was always like this.
Because depending on where you lived, who you knew, and what year you happened to die, your mummification recipe might have been wildly different from the guy in the next pit. See, unlike what movies
would have you believe, mummification wasn't some ancient McDonald's. There was no standardized secret sauce passed down by corporate embalming. It was more like grandma's cooking. A lot of tradition, a lot of guesswork, and just a sprinkle of regional chaos. If you died in Thebes, for example, chances are your body got a pretty classic treatment: nation to dry it out, resin to seal
it up, a little linen flair for good measure.
But cross the Nile, head north to the Delta, or linger too long in a time of war, and the ingredients list starts to shift. Some embalmers used imported frankincense, others grabbed the cheapest local tree sap they could find. Pine resin? Sure. Bitumen? Why not? There's even evidence that in lean times, They just boiled the body in resin like a human teabag, hoping for preservation through sheer overkill. Historians still argue whether these different techniques reflected regional beliefs, economic shifts, or just wildly different skill levels.
Was one method correct?
Was another just local superstition wrapped in gauze? No one can say for sure. What we do know is that mummification wasn't a frozen art. It evolved, adapted, sometimes got worse before it got better, like the brief period when embalmers stuffed your empty skull with mud and called it reconstruction. The thing is, even among the so-called non-elite, embalmers had reputations. In big cities, there were full-on embalming districts, neighborhoods that functioned like ancient funeral malls. You could wander through and shop for different packages.
Bronze level basic drying, no frills, silver tier eye caps, and a tiny amulet. Or if you wanted to splurge, gold deluxe includes facial makeup, organ jars,
and a complimentary spell scroll with your name spelled almost right. But more often than not, you got whatever your family could afford that week. And if times were tough, say, a poor harvest or a surprise invasion, you might get the shortcut version. That meant skipping the evisceration and just wrapping the body, hoping the dry desert air would do most of the work.
Spoiler alert, it didn't always work.
Some bodies decayed inside the wrappings, and future archaeologists found what can only be described as linen bags of goo. Still, even these haphazard attempts carried spiritual weight. The goal wasn't perfection, it was symbolic continuity. Dry the body, wrap it up, protect it from the elements, and give the soul a fighting chance to recognize its vessel in the afterlife.
If that meant using cheaper resins or skipping a few ceremonial steps, well,
you may do. What's fascinating is how embalmers improvised.
Some added herbs or spices, cinnamon, myrrh, even garlic, not for ritual reasons, but to mask the smell.
You didn't want your loved one stinking up the village before burial day. Others experimented with oil cedar.
Oil was a favorite, though some cheaper versions were just mineral oil with a fancy label.
And these weren't ancient trade secrets hidden away in scrolls. Embalming knowledge was passed down verbally, apprentice to master, generation after generation, which meant it morphed constantly. One region might favor hollowing out the body through a neat slit on the left side. Another might just make a tiny hole, insert a hot hook, and swirl things around like some horrifying fondue fork. Then there were the ritual quirks. In some villages, they'd chant spells over the resin as it cooled. In others, the embalmers wore jackal masks not just for show, but to invoke Anubis, the god of mummification.
Still others just did their job in eerie silence, treating death
like plumbing. Essential, but not exactly mystical. Your particular treatment? Let's guess.
Based on your not-so-luxury burial site and the distinct lack of golden jewelry, you probably got a regional budget package.
Maybe your body was sun-dried, first to save on natron. Maybe your wrappings were reused from temple laundry.
And maybe, just maybe, your heart was never even removed.
Some non-royal mummies have been found with everything still intact, organs and all, suggesting that some embalmers decided to skip steps, either out of compassion, laziness, or a looming
funeral deadline. And don't even get us started on the shabtis, the little servant figurines buried with the dead.
Royal tombs had hundreds, all finely carved. You might had a lump of clay vaguely shaped like a person, or just a scratched name on a shard of pottery.
A note to future tomb decorators: at least try for arms. Interestingly, some experimental
archaeologists have tried to replicate ancient recipes, using ingredients listed on temple walls and tomb labels.
The results have been
mixed. Some mixtures produced beautifully preserved results. Others turned into a sticky mess resembling barbecue sauce left in the sun.
Apparently, divine preservation does not come with a user manual, but it's also
a reminder. Mummification was an evolving science. Not everyone got the same version. Not every recipe worked. And yet, people kept trying.
Because the dream of eternity was strong enough to endure even the worst embalming jobs. Today, when we
examine mummies like you ordinary, humble, beautifully imperfect, we see more than dry flesh and crusty linen. We see hope, tradition, improvisation, and a little bit of desperation. And that's kind of beautiful. You weren't buried with gold, but you were buried with love, or at least a strong sense of obligation.
And maybe some pine tar someone swore
was frankincense. Whatever the mix, you're still here,
still wrapped,
still telling your story through every layer of resin and linen.
And that's the real magic. You lie still now, tucked beneath centuries of sand and silence. And for all the effort, the drying, the resins, the wrapping, The whispered prayers, you're not in a golden tomb.
There are no painted gods watching.
Over you. No alabaster jars holding your liver.
You were mummified, yes.
But royalty. No, in fact, your name may never have been written down. Still, you were given the rights, or at least a version of them. And that makes you part of a strange, ancient category. The non-royal mummy.
A contradiction in itself.
Because isn't mummification something we associate with pharaohs, with glittering sarcophagi, with grand processions and chanting priests? You're here to prove otherwise. You're what happens when ordinary people aim for immortality without
a royal budget. Let's face it, the line between sacred and practical blurred often in ancient
Egypt. Mummification wasn't always about piety. Sometimes it was about keeping up appearances. Your neighbors were doing it.
The guy who sold you grain was doing it.
Even the guy who couldn't afford shoes had plans to be mummified somehow, maybe.
Not in full Anubis-approved style, but enough to feel prepared.
And so people like you made it work. You pooled family resources. Maybe your cousin knew a guy in the embalming quarter. Maybe you reused an old coffin, pried open and painted over. Maybe the priest muttered half a spell before getting distracted.
by lunch.
It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Yet, this raises a strangely modern question. If you didn't get the full treatment, no sacred scrolls, no Book of the Dead, no magical amulets, did it even count? Historians still argue whether these partial mummifications offered any spiritual benefit or were merely symbolic gestures, something to comfort the living more than protect the dead. And here's the thing, there's no evidence your afterlife didn't happen. Just because you weren't buried with a retinue of alabaster jars and scarab jewelry doesn't mean the gods ignored you. Maybe Osiris judged you kindly anyway. Maybe your soul flew free, unencumbered by the weight of ritual and resin. Or maybe you're still waiting. Now consider this. Many mummies found in the desert have no names, no inscriptions, no markers of who they were in life.
They are preserved, yes, sometimes miraculously so, but they are also anonymous, untethered from memory. And that's perhaps the biggest twist of all, because in ancient Egypt, being remembered was almost as important as being embalmed.
Your name spoken aloud was your lifeline to eternity.
To be forgotten was to die a second time, and yet, here we are.
Thousands of years later, and someone you are being thought of again, talked about,
imagined in linen and resin.
Someone is wondering what kind of person you were, what you laughed at, what song played at your funeral flute solo.
Tambourine.
Who knows? You were not royal, but tonight you're remembered. Let's not romanticize everything, though. Being a non-royal mummy came with its fair share of indignities. Your toes might have been stuffed with sawdust. Your face could have been plastered over to look vaguely alive. At least one of your arms might belong to someone else. The cat buried beside you might be more famous than you are.
And yes, there's a 40% chance you were buried in a pit with dozens of others. And archaeologists had to guess which bits were yours. Still,
you made it.
Somehow you endured.
The sands didn't swallow you completely. The rituals, fractured
and clumsy as they may have been, did their job. And now let's zoom out for a moment. When people think of Egyptian mummies, they imagine kings,
queens,
gold masks, massive pyramids.
But that's not the majority of mummies.
The truth is, most preserved bodies weren't royal. They were farmers, servants, bakers,
children, midwives,
soldiers, people like you.
People who lived lives without fanfare, but still hope to be remembered. Your story, the ordinary mummy's story, is bigger than any pharaoh's.
Because it shows us that immortality was never just a luxury. It was a shared dream.
A human
longing to stay visible beyond death. To say, I mattered.
I was here. And that's why, even though your barrier was modest, maybe even rushed, your preservation is miraculous.
You weren't embalmed for glory. You were embalmed for love, for duty, for ritual. Or maybe just for the sake of trying, because trying is everything. And here we are, thousands of years later, peeling back the linen in our minds, brushing off the metaphorical dust, and letting the soft glow of a modern screen cast light on you once again. You're not just a mummy. You're proof that even without fame, wealth, or royal titles, a person can leave a trace. And maybe, just maybe, that's all anyone really wanted. So now, the story slows.
You are still there, wrapped gently in time, surrounded by the warm
hush of sand and sleep, the bustling world of ancient embalmers, incense, whispered spells, and reused coffins fades into the soft backdrop of distant memory. There's no need to remember every detail.
Let it all melt together like candle wax resins, linens, sun-baked tombs, and sleepy jackal-headed gods watching from the shadows.
The names may be forgotten, the rituals fumbled, the tombs reused and cracked, but the feeling that ancient,
Aching human wish to be held in memory lingers, steady and kind. You're safe now, wrapped not just in linen, but in understanding, in quiet recognition.
in the warm, silent truth that someone, somewhere, still cares enough to wonder who you were.
That's immortality in its softest form. Is a rest easy, little mummy.
Your story has been told, your journey revisited, and now, like a tomb or sealed against the desert wind, we gently close this tale. Good night.